Welcome everybody to a brand new episode of Identity Talk for Educators Live, the show for the unsung heroes of education. I'm your host, Sarfo-Mensah. And if this is your first time tuning in to the podcast, I welcome you and I hope that today's episode is one that will have you coming back for more. And if you're a returning listener or viewer of the podcast, as always, I welcome you back and I hope that today's episode is one that you will find informative, enlightening, and as always, insightful. So before we introduce our newest guest, I want to remind people that if you are on YouTube, please hit the red subscribe button so you can get future notifications on new episodes. If you're listening from Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your podcast, make sure you subscribe there as well. And for folks who want to help us build this platform and contribute financially, there are 4 pathways in which you can do that. Cash App, you can use our handle $IDTALK4ED. Venmo, you can use our handle @KwameSM. PayPal, if you're online, you can use our URL paypal.me/KwameSM. And we now have a new exclusive membership space for people in the Identity Talk community called the Forum. So this will be a space, a safe and brave space where we're going to continue to have conversations similar to what we have on this podcast, but there are other perks that come with it for those who have been listening to this podcast over the past 5 years. So to learn more about it, please make sure you go to our main website at identitytalk4educators.com. And that's also where you can listen to future and past episodes of the podcast. And then for our teachers and others who are looking for some summer reads, please consider adding Learn to Relearn to your book list. It is a book that is needed given the times that we're in, and I'll just leave it at that. To learn more about it, you can go to the book's main website at learntorelearn.com. For those who do not have a copy, you can go to pretty much any book retailer, but I prefer that you go directly to my publisher, Routledge, where you can get a copy of the book. And then if you are somebody that's read the book and you love what you read, please consider leaving a 5-star review on any platform where you leave your reviews. That will be greatly appreciated, and that will help us continue to amplify the messages of the book to others and expand the community. So thank you for those who have invested in Learn to Relearn, whether you've shared the book with a friend, whether you've reposted it on your social media platform, bought a copy, led a book club, or even just did a testimonial. I appreciate all the support. It adds up in the end. So thank you. All right. So today's conversation is one that is a necessary conversation. I've had past guests on this episode speak on the Israeli occupation in Palestine. And it's a conversation that needs to be amplified over and over and over again, because even now, as I'm speaking today, thinking back to October 7, 2023, I'm looking at the data. At least 50,000 Palestinians on the Gaza Strip have been murdered or have lost their lives since then. And that was just a number from a few months ago. So we don't even know what the numbers are, but we have to continue to amplify the story. We have to continue to share the counter story so people understand what's truly going on. And today's guest is somebody who lives very close to what's happening and understands more than most what that is. And I'm honored to have her on to speak on this. So without further ado, I want to bring on Dr. Sawsan Jaber to the podcast to talk about this situation in Palestine, talk about her life, her journey education, and everything else in between. So we're going to bring Sawsan on. Hello.
Hey, Kwame. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for accepting the invitation. As I mentioned, it's truly honor for you to be on this space.
Thank you. I'm honored to be here. I'm honored to have this conversation, as hard as it is to have, but it's like you said, a necessary one for sure.
Yeah, it is. It is. And I thank you for allowing us to have the space and even the transparency to even go deep, because we understand that some of the things that are happening are emotionally triggering, especially to Palestinian-Americans and others throughout the Palestinian diaspora globally. It's a tough conversation, but people need to understand the gravity of what's happening and just the magnitude of it, because it's very much complex, nuanced. But I also believe fundamentally, if you're someone that is on the side of humanity, you can't be okay with what's happening. You just can't be okay and be silent. So today's an opportunity to really go deep, and I thank you for being here. I want to go and start here. So for those who have not purchased Ta-Nehisi Coates' recent book, The Message, you need to buy a copy, because this pretty much is an entry point to what we're going to be talking about today with regard to the Israeli occupation of Palestine. But Sawsan, I want to start here with you, because as I was reading and I read the whole thing, I want to start with your grandfather, Mr. Sawsan Jaber. I want to start there, because you shared in the book how when you were a kid, he used to sit you down and all of his grandkids and talk about the importance of education as a tool for liberation. And as I'm reading this part and I'm pairing it with what I know about you with your work, I'm thinking to myself, that had to have been a harbinger for you in terms of you wanting to be an educator. I could be wrong, but I want to start there and give you an opportunity to share what inspired you to want to do this work that we're so passionate about called education.
Oh boy. I don't know if becoming an educator was something that was inspired by my grandfather as much as though justice work was inspired by my grandfather. Unfortunately, culturally, anything that is humanities is not a desired field, because we've been convinced by our oppressors that anybody who is in the humanities, who's a storyteller, who's a teacher, is failed. Right? Our parents want us to be doctors and want us to be engineers, and if you're not one of the above, then that's not what's desired. And so when I initially told my family I wanted to be a teacher, they were really upset. I was the first person in my family to go to college. So I would say that my desire to be educated was definitely something that was born from my grandfather and my father, who came here as refugees and never had the opportunity to be educated themselves. But the connection to justice, the deep-rooted connection to justice and interracial, like the justice across causes, being very weary and aware of growing up in Brooklyn, of the differences of people and really celebrating those differences, was something that I grew up with. Arabs are very communal, like many other cultures. And so we grow up with multiple generations in a house. And my grandfather was very much a part of the fabric of my upbringing, as my grandmother was as well. And there's 135 grandkids now. He would sit, as many of us, I'm one of the older grandkids, and he would sit us all down and he would feed us with his hands. And he would tell us stories of Palestine and stories of how he escaped in 1948 during the occupation, as he watched his brothers martyred and his mother fighting, who was a widow, to save the village, or save as many people in the village, because the attack happened in the very early morning hours while people were sleeping. And so we grew up listening to those stories. We grew up, between us and Palestine was really a TV screen. And we grew up understanding that our education was going to be the key to liberating Palestine, to liberating ourselves, to liberating our identities, to telling our own stories, because we already know as educators that marginalized groups have never owned their own stories, ever. And so I think the idea too that I grew up in schools in the United States and never ever felt represented. I remember as young as 6 in Brooklyn, being given a thumbtack and asked to put my thumbtack on where my family came from because I was a community of immigrants and I couldn't find Palestine on the map. And my teacher was really frustrated at my confusion. And it was the first time that I realized that my identity was problematic, and I was 6. And that continued all the way through my doctoral dissertation, where my methodologist was not happy that I was focusing on Palestinian-American students for my topic and did everything she could to try to change my subject group. And I dug my heels to the ground and insisted, and thankfully had a really amazing dissertation chair who was very supportive and stood behind me and helped me to get the dissertation that I wanted published. That was important to me. That was my kind of identity story in a lot of different ways, and the footprint that I wanted to leave in the field. So I think that very early on was one of the reasons where I had a teacher in 4th grade who made me feel like my voice was important, who made me feel like I was a storyteller, who made me realize that I was a storyteller. And that's how I introduce myself when I do keynotes today. I always introduce myself as a storyteller because my life is a series of stories. My Palestinian identity are stories that I've inherited from my ancestors. My Islamic identity is a series of stories from the Holy Quran. So every intersection of my identity is a combination of these beautiful stories that are me. And so she was the reason why I was like, I want to do this for kids. I leveraging the power of words, of literacy. And I remember when I read Frederick Douglass as a student, and I recall reading how white people who taught Black enslaved people to read and write were punished so severely, and how he would give up his food to read. And I thought to myself, our oppressors are trying to keep us from storytelling, from reading, from writing, from these literacy skills because of the power that they hold. I want to be able to give that power to kids in classrooms. So I think that was really my passion of like, and that's why like it's such a big thing in my own practice as a teacher to co-create with my students, and that they are content creators and not content consumers. That's such a big part of my practice, and that they love themselves and their identities first, because I'm not sure that I ever sat in a classroom where my identity was front and center. My language was welcomed into the space. My ancestors and the stories that they told us were welcomed into the space. And so when we talk about all these buzzwords like belonging and differentiation, how do you ever belong, and how do you differentiate for students that you don't ever really understand? What does actual belonging in schools mean? Like, I don't know that we've done the deep dive as educators to really get to know the stuff that's below the surface in order for us to really create spaces where students actually belong and where they feel like they can take those risks, where we know that research shows that students who feel like they belong and feel like the space is theirs, they show 25% more gains. And so you can have the best teacher in the world, but if the kid doesn't feel like they don't belong, then that work is not landing. And so where is that in our practice? And so I think it's a combination of a lot of those things. It's the idea that our field is a field of serving, of servitude, that we can serve students. We literally are the gatekeepers of what tomorrow looks like. By determining what curriculum looks like and what we're exposing students to, we're crafting the future of tomorrow. And we are creating spaces where we can either do the healing work, or we can continue to create the harm and replicate the harm that's happening in the socio-political climate that we're seeing in today's world, and particularly in this country. And so our classrooms can be either or. And so I find so much power. I always say teachers are the most powerful people in the world, and I wanted to be that person for sure.
Mm. And you mentioned the word belonging. And as you're talking about that, I'm just thinking about your own family's history, going back to your grandfather growing up in Deir Yassin, and thinking about the history of that. Now, what's amazing to me is there are people who are academic researchers, who are pundits, who say that the massacre never happened. And I'm reading this in the book, and I'm like, there's no way that this can be refuted. You have a first person account that's sharing what's going on. And he is saying that he hasn't been able to come back to his own home in over 76 years. So if y'all do the math, 1948, that's a very significant year. Official start of Israelis' occupation of Palestine. What's happening around that time? You have Palestinians who are being killed by Jewish militia from different gangs, which is causing displacement, people fleeing to different places to find residency, to find refuge. So as I'm thinking about that, I'm wondering, how has your family's history shaped your own perspective of home?
That's another really complex question, because it's really thinking about defining what is home, right?
Right.
And I think that we are the saying, like, we really don't belong here or there. My American passport I've been fortunate enough to be able to enter Palestine through my American passport. I know many Palestinians in the diaspora who were displaced to like Jordan and neighboring countries around Palestine. They have never been able to go back to Palestine. But even as an American citizen, my passport allows me to go in with the acceptance of Israeli officials. And so you are humiliated on the border. You're questioned, you're interrogated, your social media is interrogated, your phone is often taken. Sometimes they decide they don't want to let you in. You could be there for hours or days, depending on the whim of an Israeli soldier, and it is your homeland. But you're never made to feel like home, because that kind of follows through. It's definitely an apartheid state, as Ta-Nehisi describes. You're surrounded by armed militia in what many people consider like these two separate countries, but they're not really two separate countries, right? There's Israeli control of the entire region. And so Palestinians in what's considered Palestinian territories have no agency over their land, have no freedom of movement, they can't go from one side to the other. They can't build as they want to. There's no agency. There's no freedom at all. And so if you really think about that, then you think about, like, do Palestinians who live in Palestine in what's considered Palestinian territories, is that home? It's not safe. You have no agency. So is it home? I don't know if it's home. I don't know that we have a home. I know home in my heart, and since I was born, has always been Palestine. It's in my veins. But and I've never been accepted in the United States. Like, Banks calls us failed citizens, and it's not because we failed to become citizens. It's because society has failed to accept us as citizens. And so, like, even for generations, right? I was born and raised here in the United States, but when people want to be rude and want to say something that's not nice to me, they'll often say, go back to your country. And it's like, okay, well, where is that? Right? Like, and what makes you think that this is not my country? And so I don't know where home is. I know that we are striving for a homeland. We are striving for home. And the Palestinian-American identity is such a nuanced identity today, more than ever, because it's our tax dollars. We just vetoed another ceasefire last night in the United Nations, right? A ceasefire, a humanitarian ceasefire. We can't even accept a humanitarian ceasefire. So how does that make me feel as an American, as a tax-paying, contributing to this genocide American citizen? My tax dollars are killing my own people. And talking about it is dangerous, right? I've been doxxed. I've been followed around there. If you look up my name, you'll see the websites. Please don't look them up. Don't give them any more traction. But there's websites there. I have been doxxed, right? Like, the damage is real for me telling my story. We talk about storytelling and pride of identity. We talk about our kids, and there are so many Palestinian kids. I happen to live in Illinois, in the largest Palestinian community in the country, and it's called Little Palestine on the map. So It's really ironic that even in this context, where there are so many Palestinian kids telling our stories, owning our identities, having pride in my ancestry and in my grandfather's stories, that Ta-Nehisi Coates can tell my story, but I can't, right? And that's not to say that Ta-Nehisi Coates hasn't gotten pushback for the stories that he's telling as well. I am 100% sure that he has. But the idea of me telling my story leads to my kids being threatened, leads to job loss, leads to, like, all of these different the prices that we pay for telling our truth and owning our history. Because and I will also backtrack and say, like, we're living in a country that has created policies and laws to protect a foreign country, and we don't have those policies and laws in place to protect our own country here. So just the craziness of it all, right? And how so many people choose not to see it, it's beyond me. So I don't know if I answered the question about home, because it's such a complex. I don't know that we have a home. We have never been accepted here in the United States, and I think in the last 2 years more than ever, the pushback against being a Palestinian-American and owning Palestinian identity has been so aggressive and very public that it's a double-edged sword, because it's brought the conversation to a lot of people and forced them to face it and to really ask questions. And so we're seeing Palestinian solidarity in ways that we've never seen it historically, but there's also a genocide happening and people are being starved to death. And we're supporting it and funding it. And without our money as a country and our political backing, Israel could not continue to do what it's doing today. It just couldn't. But at the same time, you're still not accepted here in the larger context, right? Like, you're still fighting for your story to be a valid story, to exist. Like you said it yourself, there's still a denial that the Nakba even was a thing historically, even though we still have Nakba survivors who are telling the story, and you have IDF soldiers who are telling the same story, right? There are so many documentaries about IDF soldiers who now feel guilt and regret over the things that the atrocities and the crimes that they committed in 1948 and continue to commit today. But we're still saying it can't be true. And we're going to continue to protect this state that, and I don't know if have you read Omar Al-Akkad? He wrote a book about, like, the title of the book is People Will Look Back and Say That This shouldn't have ever happened at a point. I think the title kind of connotes that there's going to come a point in time where people are going to look back and say, oh my God, how did we allow this to happen? Or this shouldn't have happened. But at that point, it's too late. And even now I'm reading so many posts on social media saying, like, the tides are changing, things are changing. And I'm thinking to myself, but 17,000 children who are WCNF, Wounded Child, No Surviving Family. It's a code for Palestinian children that was created just for them. 17,000 wounded children who are the only survivors of their families. Let's not talk about, that's like an astounding number. I was at a conference a couple of months ago and there was 20,000 people there. And I just looked around and you couldn't even walk because it was so crowded. And I just thought to myself, there are 17,000, almost this number of children who are orphans, who are severely wounded, who have been amputated, who have legs amputated, who have arms amputated, who are now have no one to take care of them. And my tax dollars have funded that. And we're still trying to convince people that this needs to stop. And we're still vetoing a ceasefire. We're still not allowing humanitarian aid and food into the region. Like, I don't understand. There's no words for it.
Are you ready to take your commitment to identity affirming education to the next level? Then join the forum, the new and exclusive membership space for the Identity Talk community. With membership tiers starting at $3 a month, you'll get early access to podcast episodes, bonus content, our Qualms Quotes monthly newsletter, and monthly live Q&A sessions. You'll also unlock discounts on workshops and products, engage in community discussions, access exclusive community and networking opportunities, and even business ad roles during episodes if you're a sponsor level member. Whether you're an ally, advocate, co-conspirator, accomplice, or sponsor, there's a place for you in the forum. So head over to identitytalk4educators.com/pricing plans/list and join the movement today. Yeah, Sawsan, I want to get deep with you for a second, because just thinking back to this past election that we had, and I'm thinking back to the DNC that was in Chicago.
Yeah.
I'm thinking about the fact, and I talked about this with Abir because Abir was on here a few months ago, and I asked her about this as well. What's interesting is we're in the city where you have arguably the largest Palestinian-American community there is. And to not have a single Palestinian-American be able to speak on what's happening in Gaza, I just thought on the Democrat side, it was a missed opportunity to really bring that story to light. And then as I'm listening to Kamala Harris answer questions about it, when she keeps on saying Israel has a right to defend itself, I'm reading the book and I'm thinking to myself, what threat are Palestinians when they don't even have the ability to defend themselves, right? Like, why do we keep having this allegiance to Israel, and yet you have Palestinians who are vulnerable? They're not even able to have agency within their own land, but yet want to continue to provide weaponry to those who are oppressing them. And when you mentioned about tax dollars, that's what comes to mind for me, right? So as someone who's an American, it's conflicting because you're looking at these presidential candidates and I'm like, people say take whoever is the best candidate out of this pool, but it's like, you don't really feel that too confident about any candidate, honestly. When you think about the line of logic there. So I don't know. I'm just thinking.
Yeah, I think that is definitely indicative of history. When we talk about Palestine, when did you ever see a Palestinian on a news broadcast, right? When were we ever part of our own story? And that's
right.
by design, right? That is by design. I think if we really look back at even like critical race theory and all of this anti-critical race theory stuff, if we dig back into critical race theory, you'll find that Kimberly Crenshaw and Derek Bell uncovered the Zionist movement in Harvard University in critical race theory in the 1970s and the 1960s. They talked about it, right? This is not just about Palestinians. This is where we see that the intersections of marginalization coming to fruition. You cannot support one group of people while you are actively engaging and supporting the oppression of another group of people. And I think advocates and equity advocates and people who have spoken to justice have been saying this forever. Martin Luther King said it before anybody, right? Like the injustice anywhere is a threat to justice anywhere. So everywhere. And so at the end of the day, like this is not new. These are not new ideas, but for whatever reason, we've been so siloed, right? And I think that what happens too is that marginalized groups are just trying to survive, right? And that goes back to Bettina's love, is that we want to do more than just survive, but we're still in survival mode. Many of us are. And so when you're in survival mode, I think, and then there's this fear that's constantly elevated of who we are, of each other, right? Like, I think that this election polarized people of color more than any other election historically, because if you didn't vote for Kamala Harris, then you didn't support, it was about Blackness. And even though, yes, there was a lot of anti-Blackness at play there, but for many, it wasn't about anti-Blackness. It was about what she represented as a candidate. And it was very difficult to vote for someone. And I definitely, I'm not going to share, like, I didn't vote for Trump. I'm not endorsing Trump in any shape or form. But it was really such a moral conflict for Palestinian-Americans to vote for somebody who was standing up and saying, we're going to continue to genocide and kill and support the killing of your own people. Like, I will never forget the moment, Kwame, when I was sitting in a leadership meeting at work. And my daughter called me 3 times. And my kids know, like, when I'm at work, unless it's an emergency, like, text me, don't call me. And she called me 3 times in a row. So I was like, okay, something's up. And so I stepped out of the meeting. I called her back and she was crying hysterically. And she's like, mom, did you open your phone? And I said, no, not yet. What's going on? And she said, just open your Instagram. And it was the first time Israel bombed Shifa Hospital. And there was an image of a father who was walking around with the remains of 7 members of his family, his children and his wife, and in 2 shopping bags. He was walking around and he was crying. And my daughter saw the image and she's like, Mom, they bombed the hospital and like the kids and the incubators and this man. And she was just beside herself, like so upset. And like, how could they bomb a hospital? It was a whole other level. It was shocking. And they said it was an accident. And now it's become a normal thing that we are bombing hospitals. There are no hospitals. There are no functioning hospitals in Gaza now. And I just thought to myself, like, how can you see these images and still feel like there's an argument here? There's nothing to argue. How can I endorse that? How can I vote for that? How can I put my money willingly there and be able to sleep at night? You can't take the Palestinian out of me, right? You can't. You just can't. And you can't take the humanity out of me either. It doesn't have to be Palestine. It could have been anybody that we were actively endorsing and supporting a genocide, and I would have reacted in the same way. My morality will not allow me to put my vote with someone who's who's standing up in this critical time period in the hub of where the Palestinian community is, with absolutely no reserve, and not even, like, she's saying it with her chest, right? We're going to continue to support Israel in this genocide.
Every time.
Yeah, and erase Palestinian existence out of the narrative entirely, right? Like, even like the media and other conferences. I went to educational conferences where the conference organizers refer to it as the Israeli-Hamas war. like dehumanizing Palestinians and erasing Palestinian suffering out of 76 years of occupation. We're here. We have been here all along. Just because our stories have been erased and silenced does not mean that our oppression and that the things that we have faced are non-existent. They are here. And those stories are coming to the surface, right? More people are telling the stories, like Ta-Nehisi Coates and others who are talking about it. And so we're hearing more and more of that. That was such a really difficult time for us, because I think that we had hope that there would be something different or something better, or at least a recognition of something. And that never came. And so we were left with like monsters to vote for. Like both of them, to me, there was obviously like Trump is anti everybody, and the things that he's doing now are words that I don't even know how we start to like fix this, right? But this is a temporary period, and it too shall pass. And the work will continue, and we'll continue working against it. So there are no words to justify what's happening in our socio-political context today, but there are also no words to justify an act of genocide that's actively targeting innocent people and is being live streamed at the moment that we're watching this happening. Like that's what makes us different than anything else that we've ever faced historically, is that we are sitting in our homes watching this. Even CNN yesterday was showing images of the genocide in Gaza. So like you can't, if you don't know, it's because you've opted not to know at this point, right? Like you've really chosen to close your eyes and use your privilege not to see, but it's out there. So how can you see and not feel compelled to do or act or stop or at least agree, right? Like the smallest thing is just to stop pushing back against this narrative that exists. I just don't understand it.
I don't either. And I want to stay on this topic of framing, because a lot of the reason why people have the views that they have about what's happening in Palestine is because of what they hear. They don't take the time to interrogate what's being said. They don't take the time to interrogate the messaging, the images, and the source of the information. So if you don't mind, I just want to read an excerpt that really speaks to this, because it pretty much hits home everything that we're talking about right now. But just in the book, as I'm reading this, we're talking about framing. Now, this is what Ta-Nehisi is saying about journalism, right? And he says, and I quote, "Journalists claim to be hearing both sides as though a binary opposition had been set down by some disinterested God. But it is the journalists themselves who are playing God. It is the journalists who decide which sides are legitimate and which are not, which views shall be considered and which pushed out of the frame. And this power is an extension of the power of other curators of the culture, network execs, producers, publishers, whose core job is deciding which stories get told and which do not. When you are erased from the argument and purged from the narrative, you do not exist." Now, if you were to substitute journalist with teacher, you would get the same narrative, because we know of teachers who have engaged in anti-Semitic behavior and have engaged in some identity-based harm to Palestinian children, to Arab students, to Muslim students, and have not gotten consequences for it, because they may be in a state that, whether it's red or blue or purple, whatever color, wherever they are, they support the behavior and perpetuate it through policy and other ways. But these are some of the teachers that are in our classrooms right now, and they have the license to distort stories, distort reality. So my question for you is, how do we get educators, and honestly, it's not even just educators, but it's really school systems, to really review curriculum and critically examine information and dominant narratives that make it difficult for students to really build true agency when it comes to what's going on. And this will be a perfect segue once we get into the book, but I want you to talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, I feel like that harm is happening to marginalized groups across the board, right? Like
That's right.
I've taught in primarily Latinx communities in the last 8 years, and I feel like that harm exists towards our immigrant Mexican population who are really, really impacted by our current president and the policies.
Yes.
And so like there's a lack of empathy and understanding when it comes to students from marginalized backgrounds when our teaching force is primarily a 90% white teaching force, and the identity is so different and the demographic divide is so wide, I think. And then the real work, right? Like not the performative, let's differentiate this lesson or let's be culturally responsive. So we throw a book of a author of color in a class and call it a day. Like we've checked it off our list. We're responsive. It's so much more than that, right? Because one book will never represent a whole group of people, right? So that whole idea of being culturally responsive on the surface is more harmful than it is, because you're still perpetuating the single story, right? And not the complexity and the nuances of what it means to be a certain identity, any identity. And so I think it's about immersion. I think it's about immersing ourselves in these narratives, in these stories. Like when I started the Arab American Educators Network to just kind of network with Arab American educators, along with Abiyat and 2 other educators, to bring Arab teachers around the country together as a support and as a platform, and also as an advocacy group. And we did an informal survey to just ask what books are being used in schools where there are large populations of Arab students. And it often came back that it was The Kite Runner or I Am Malala, which are both super problematic because both of them are not Arab authors. Pakistan and Afghanistan are not Arab countries, so they're not Arab authors. B, they both represent this, like, there's no understanding between Arab and Muslim identities, right? Like most people think they conflate both of those things together, and an Arab is a Muslim. When you tell people that Christianity exists in large numbers in Palestine and many Palestinians are Christian, people are shocked, right? Like it's a shocker, even though Jesus was Christian and a Palestinian, right? Like he is from Palestine. And so like people don't make that connection. We kind of have this like cognitive dissonance when it comes to these stories and the realities of them. But at the end of the day, it's about giving students the opportunity to read all of these different stories. So like one of the things that we did in my district was we were studying genocide, and oftentimes the genocide that is studied is the Holocaust, which is important. We all need to read about and understand the Holocaust, but the Holocaust isn't the only genocide that exists, right? Like we have what's happening in Congo. We have what happened in Bosnia. We have what's happening in Palestine currently. When we dug in deep, what happened to our Black enslaved people was a genocide. What happened to Native Americans was a genocide, right? These are genocides by definition. And so what we did was, instead of giving students one story, we said, okay, here are all these different, we're not going to call it a genocide, all these different examples of dehumanization that occurred to these different groups of people. You're going to go out and research, right? We gave them some parameters of like, here's what we want you to find out: the history, who against who, what caused it, all these things. And you're going to map it on the pyramid of hate. And then we're going to give you the definition of genocide from the United Nations, and you're going to decide, and you're going to make an argumentative 5-minute documentary on, is this a genocide according to the United Nations definition? You decide. I'm not going to decide for you. I'm not going to be the gatekeeper. You do the research. You compile the research and synthesize what you found using a graphic organizer that's a bunch of open-ended questions. Then you as a group decide, and you talk to your peers and share with your peers your findings based on this definition. And so we had kids researching 17 different examples of dehumanization and finding genocide in many of them. And then the conclusion after students presented in a student-led conversation. I don't give my opinion in anything. I give students the information. I create these open-ended questions. I give them opportunities to really follow their heart and their assignments and things that they're interested in. And then I give them space to share the public learning piece with each other, right? Students with students is the most powerful learning opportunities. And the students themselves said, we as a country and educational systems historically have a hard time calling what happens to Black and brown people a genocide. We don't call what happens to Native Americans a genocide, even though it is a genocide. We don't call what happened to Black enslaved people a genocide, even though it is a genocide. We refuse to call what's happening in Palestine today genocide, even though it's a genocide. And why is that? But we're ready to call Ukraine a genocide, right? We're ready to call Bosnia a genocide because they are white people who have been impacted in those situations. So they're making they are noticing as their peers are kind of presenting these trends and these ties. And so these are students who have used their voice and their agency and their research skills and their English skills in an English classroom to draw conclusions across the board about things that are super, super important. That's what critical literacy is, right? This is what we cultivate this idea of global citizenship in our classrooms, where we are putting out students who are aware of the world beyond themselves, beyond the four walls of their classroom, beyond the identities of, that's real responsiveness. That's them saying, okay, I know who I am. I know what's happening in the world in my local context, but I can also understand the domino effect, how I, as an American, am contributing to something that's happening on the other side of the world very actively that I need to also be a proponent of stopping. I need to understand how when I buy an iPhone that I'm supporting death in Congo. I need to understand that, right? These things are interrelated. Every tech device that I purchase is killing people in Congo. That is something that our kids need to understand, because they're going to be the lawmakers and the police officers and the teachers of the future. And I always say this every time I speak to teachers, is I always wonder, and I genuinely wonder, that if teachers, the police officers, the 5 police officers that murdered George Floyd, if only one of them sat in a classroom where these conversations were happening, would George Floyd be here to talk to us today? Would he still be alive? If only one police officer had an education where critical literacy was at the forefront and at the core, and he understood, or she understood, the things that are happening in our world today and why there was so much fear that George Floyd ended up dying, and hate that he ended up dying on our watch, and so many other men to follow, right, and are being funneled into the school to prison nexus. Why is that happening on our watch? And we're aware of it and we're talking about it, right? And we're not able to have these conversations to raise awareness and give students the opportunity to see that your words matter, and that your ability to talk and frame and advocate, not just for yourself, right? That's why cultural responsiveness, to me, for people, when they understand it as like, I just need to create mirrors for my students. No, cultural responsiveness for me is I need to go out and seek cultures in the world that my students also don't have access to, in order for them to really have this idea of like, I can coexist, I can build the tools to understand and learn and appreciate people from all different backgrounds, whether they're in this space or not, because technology has made our world so small, right? And we're going to engage and interact with each other. Foreign policy, our leaders have made the world so much smaller. Things are related. Anybody who is even like an advocate of the earth and global warming needs to be asking questions about all these bombs that are dropping and how it's affecting our environment, how it's affecting the air that people are breathing, and all these other things, like the natural part of the world. Let's forget the humans for a minute, because that we call it complex so that people are afraid to ask questions and really engage in conversations. When we call anything complex, it makes people not want to touch it. But it's not really complex at all, right? It's very simple. It's as simple as Black enslavement. There's nothing to argue there. It's clear as day, right? There's oppression happening. It's as complex as Native Americans and who owns right to the land that we're sitting on today. There's nothing complex about it, right? It is very simple. But when we call it complex, then people are like, oh, I don't understand, so I choose not to engage because it's too hard to understand. And so we are complicit in education for oppressing many oppressed groups, and for continuing the dehumanization of so many of the people that we're talking about today, particularly Palestine, because I don't know of a school yet that has taught Palestine authentically, other than to bring it up in the Holy War and to say that Palestinians can't coexist, and that the Middle East is a troubled region, even though the only reason that the Middle East is a troubled region is because the West has meddled with the Middle East ever since the beginning of time by trying to colonize different parts of it and creating these borders and lands that didn't make sense. We are the reason that the Middle East is a troubled region, right? It's not because the people are troubled. But that's not a history that you're ever going to learn in American school. You're never going to read a novel like Mornings in Janine, or They Called Me a Lioness, or Tasting the Sky by Ibtisam Barakat, or Homeland by Hannah Mushabbak, or Hilwa's Secrets by Safa Suleiman. Like, there are so many great books out there that tell the Palestinian story, and telling the Palestinian story does not take away from anyone, right? Like, and there's this like conflation of Zionism and anti-Semitism that's also being used to silence people. We're not talking about Jewish people. Some of our biggest advocates, and my grandfather's stories always center his Jewish friends because people lived together harmoniously before 1948. This isn't about religion. It was never about religion. This is about colonization. It's about land. It's about political moves. It's about Zionism. And any group of people should be able to criticize a political entity and their actions, especially when they're constituting and actively engaged in a genocide, without feeling fear or fearing the ramifications and the implications of what that could lead to, especially in a country where we are wearing this idea of freedom of speech and democracy that doesn't seem to exist anymore. I don't know if it ever existed, but definitely doesn't seem to exist today.
Yeah, the irony in all this is very striking. It's so funny because, of course, I'm an educator, you're an educator. We hear about agency all the time. Student voice. Our kids need to be able to speak more. They should be able to express themselves. But I believe it's selective. See, the operative word is selective agency.
Yep.
We don't want you to build agency when it comes to critical issues that impact marginalized communities. Only in this box, right? So I'm even thinking about how we get trained to become teachers in the United States. I went through a whole teacher training program, and not once was Paulo Freire's Pedagogies of the Press was assigned to me as a required reading. I read all these other books. I had to read about Piaget. I had to read about Lev Vygotsky's Zone of Proximal Development. I had to read about all these other people. But when it came to the actual scholars who provide us with the answers many generations ago about what's happening now, who's assigning that as a text on the syllabus? So we have to look at the way that we get trained as teachers. Number one, what kind of text are we reading to get teachers prepared to engage in critical dialogue like this and to question what they're teaching and at least ask themselves, does this make sense?
Who's teaching? That's the question, right? Who's teaching? And nope. there's a gatekeeper. They don't look like us. And even when people like us come into schools as professionals to do the work and really advocate for students, it is a very aggressive, antagonistic environment for teachers of color. We are dropping out of the field in droves because of how antagonistic it is for us. And I was like, if I'm feeling this fire, what are my kids feeling? Like, what are these students feeling if this is how I am in an administrative position and feeling the fire more than ever before? How do my students feel if I have privilege and power in this space through my degrees, through my education, through my positionality, and I feel like I am being muffled and I feel like I'm being attacked? Before I even started in my current job, people were saying, let's not have her. She is Palestinian. She's anti-Semitic. Just because I'm Palestinian, I'm by default anti-Semitic. Before you even met me and even had a chance to know who I am or what I'm about, I am being attacked in this space. And I have to do, it's one of my students said, Dr. J, we have to work twice as hard to get half the recognition. And I think her words always resonate in the back of my mind because I don't even know that working twice as hard is getting us the recognition. I don't know that I want the recognition. I just want to be able to do my job sometimes. And I think that my identity is constantly centered versus all the wonderful things that I know I bring to the table as a professional educator in the space. And so when we talk about curriculum and the gatekeeping that happens in curriculum and the single stories that exist in our curriculum, we need to be asking ourselves, well, who's doing the teaching? Who's sitting at the table when curriculum is being written? Who's sitting at every level, at a college and university level to teacher practitioners or even professional development? Like I remember when I joined Our Voice Alliance in 2018, and it was cultivating BIPOC keynote speakers. Like that was the crux of it, to really bring equity to the surface for schools and educators in conference spaces. There was like just a general survey of like, who are keynote speakers and what are they getting paid? There were no keynote speakers in 2018 of color primarily. And if there were, they were getting paid pennies in comparison to white keynote speakers in the field who were saying things that really spoke to their lived experiences. So when we continue to erase and not give people of color a seat at the table, teachers of color, leaders of color. I did a training for 40 superintendents in Illinois. Not one person there was no melanin in that room, not one person of color. And it was 38 men and 2 women, right? So we want to sit and talk about like equity and really centering. I can read as many books about the Black identity and the Black experience as I want, and I can, and I will never, ever be able to advocate and understand the way a Black person in this country understands and advocate. Like, I will never understand your experience as much as you would understand that experience. And therefore, it is so important for there to be diverse voices. And when we don't have that voice represented, we need to actively go out and look for it, right? Like I do for my teachers, I had lightning.
Or create a space for it.
Yeah, I had lightning talks where I brought in voices that we didn't have represented in our building through virtual conversations for my students and for the teachers every single month, a different voice from a different background, because it is important. I remember going to a conference with somebody was interviewing Sharif Mekki, the Black Educators Collaborative founder. And
yeah, Sharif, my guy.
Well, he's amazing, right? And the facilitator was saying, we need Black male teachers for Black students. And my immediate thought was, no, we need Black male teachers for everybody, right? It's not just for the Black students, it's for everybody, because that is how we humanize. That's how we create opportunities for just human connection and human engagement. And the fact that I have a Black teacher that I can look up to, that I can love, who's going to love me back, who's going to pour into me, who's going to help me find myself regardless of what my background is. That's how we start to shift the narrative. But we don't exist, because why would I, as a Black teacher, as a Palestinian teacher, as a Latina teacher, go back to the place where I was harmed as a student, and it was such a violent space for me. And then as a teacher, it becomes even more and more violent. And the higher up you move in administration, in buildings, and you are really an advocate, they love you until they don't, right? And then it gets old for them, and the work is just, you're too dark. And like, it's just, we're not ready as a country for that work. We're not creating space. We keep talking about really wanting the shift and the change, but we're not putting in place the foundations to ensure that the shift and the change are happening in transformative ways, putting people in places where we want to, there's initiatives in so many states to bring people of color as educational leaders and bring teachers of color into the field. But once they're there, what are we doing to protect them and to cultivate space for them? So when we want to talk about our education as educators, yeah, of course, it's going to be a very traditional white education with white voices.
That's right.
Yeah, even when I did my AP research class with my students, we turned it into research as a form of activism. We're going to focus for our lit review on finding BIPOC researchers and really think about, like, when we are focusing on, and also focusing on doing research about BIPOC communities, because when we talk about research that existed 20 years ago about students, who were we researching and how were we applying that to all kids, even though it wasn't all kids that were being researched? And why does it continue to fail marginalized students? Because the research was never done for or about marginalized students. So we now, as researchers, need to really think about that. And let's think about the issues that are really important for you as students, as senior students. And my students wrote 5-chapter dissertations, 50 source lit reviews that were peer edited about topics like colorism in Mexican communities, about what it means to be a bicultural student where one culture is being represented, about real topics. And then they have to present to these, and these are kids that there are kids that are talking and advocating and changing, because they understand that even research is a way of silencing or elevating, right? Even research. We don't think of it that way, but giving someone the power to put research out there about a group of people that people can cite and reference and use as a foundation to make a movement and change in education is integral. And it's another missing piece of this puzzle. So there's opportunity everywhere, but it's not until we have true solidarity, Ta-Nehisi Coates kind of solidarity, where we use our platforms and our space and our voices, and we stop operating in these silos, but we understand, like, what does it mean for me as an educator to show up for my students who are being impacted by these immigration laws in this moment today? How does Sawsan show up? How do you show up for your Palestinian students in this moment today? How many schools with Palestinian students are even using trauma-informed practices? How many are even allowing students to acknowledge the fact that they are living in this perpetual state of trauma for the last 2 years, for the last 76 years, but really for the last 2 years, where our trauma is on display on social media. How many of us are acknowledging that? How do we show up for our Black students as they watch more and more Black men being killed on our watch by people with power? How do we show up? What does that look like, right? Like, let's not just talk the talk, but how do we use our locus of control, our power, to really show solidarity as educators in the classroom, as educational leaders in schools today? That's the question that we really need to be interrogating and answering as educators. If we're not having that conversation today, the only reason that we're in the situation we're in today is because we haven't had that conversation, right? Because even when it comes to, like, people think that these conversations only have to happen with BIPOC students. No, our white students need to have these conversations first. So do our white teachers. So do our white superintendents and our white principals. That's where the conversation needs to start. How do you show up in solidarity in this moment for all these groups of people that are being directly attacked and targeted by our current administration and have been forever, right? But especially today, how do we show up in solidarity? Do we continue to censor and silence? Or do we bring in those books that are being censored and we continue to do the real work, and we continue to talk to kids who are so much more fierce and ready for this conversation than many adults are about the real thing, so that when they go out into the world, they're not going out blindfolded. They're going out and they're ready to change it and make it better, because we need to do that hard work and that healing work today more than ever.
Hi friends, it's me, Thaddeus from Thaddeus Nature Notebook. Are you loving our journey into the wild and learning all about awesome animals? Then don't forget to subscribe. You can find Thaddeus Nature Notebook on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, and Spotify. Just hit that subscribe button and never miss a new episode. And if you're on YouTube, give us a thumbs up and leave a comment about your favorite animal. Thanks for listening and exploring nature with me. Let's keep discovering together. Now back to my daddy's cell.
Yeah, for sure. And this is a perfect segue into talking about new book, Pedagogies of Voice. So I had Crystal on the show. Well, she's been on here twice.
Yep.
And I'm going to have Shane and Marlo on a few weeks from now. So by the time the book comes out, I would have had all the co-authors here talking about this book. So now you're the second person up. So you mentioned about your own children. And I'm thinking about this book, Pedagogies of Voice, and what this means in this current time. I want you to think about this question, not just as an educator, but also as a mother, because you had to have thought about your children as you were writing your chapter or section about the importance of pedagogy of voice. So tell me about that process, and what are you hoping that educators will gain from reading this book?
So I think as a mother, right, I feel like I've always tried to lead as best as I can in a space of how can I model for my children who they are and what their stance is supposed to be in this world in real ways, right? Like, I always think of myself as an ancestor. I talk about my grandfather. My grandfather is such an integral part of my life. My father, my mother, I always say my journey is mapped on their hands. Like, my father's hands are calloused because he physically worked with his hands his entire life to be able to put us in the best schools to come here. Like, they're my unsung heroes, right? Like, they're the reason why I'm here. They're the reason why I feel all of this pride and this need to fight and work. And so I think to myself, like, what do I need to leave behind for my children? My parents came here as refugees, and what they gave us was the gift of staying true to our culture and our religion. They gave us that gift. We had to figure out how to bring being an American and being a Palestinian, a Muslim Palestinian together. Those things are often seen by the American mainstream as in contention with each other, but they're not. Not at all. Not if you really understand what those things are. That's a different conversation for a different time. So I think for my kids, I want to know that I am doing everything that I can for my grandkids, for their kids, right? And their kids' kids, like my great-grandkids, like that I'm doing everything that I can within my locus of control to make this world better, because I know it can be. And I'm modeling that because I hope that they carry that forward, that they carry this torch, that I pass it on, and that they carry it forward. This book was a child of, it was written in solidarity, right? Like, This book was written with 4 people from 4 different backgrounds, racially, ethnically, religiously, by design. And I think that we all, even like the diversity in what we represent in education was there. Like we have elementary, we have high school, we have math, we have English, we have educational leaders. Like it was written really thinking about all the different voices and all the different ways of the field and the world, and how we can bring that in together to do the healing work. And like the idea of like getting kids to really love themselves first, because the world around us, like I always talk about this when I do my public speaking, is this idea of hidden curriculum, right? The world is a hidden curriculum, and our kids live in the world. And no matter how much a mother tells her child, you're great, I love you, you're the best thing, the world is saying a lot of different things to your child. And that is what's sticking, right? Because I even, with my youngest daughter, who's 18, she always says, Mom, you're going to say that because you're my mom. And I'm like, no, but it's true, right? But you're still the mom. And there's going to be this idea that you're just affirming because that's your job. And we say in Arabic, like a child, like the worst child in his mom's eyes is a gazelle. Like he's the best behaved child, because a mom is always going to be biased when it comes to her kid. And so your kid will never really take what you say to them wholeheartedly, because the world is saying the opposite. And so the job of a classroom is to really create spaces where we teach kids, right? You talk about learning to unlearning so that we can relearn. This idea of unlearning the messages that this hidden curriculum kind of gives us so that we can relearn how to love ourselves in a way that's going to give us the strength and the power to fight for ourselves and fight for our children and fight for our future. And so I hope that I'm planting those seeds by modeling those things for my kids, because this work it's going to keep going. Oppression is never going to go away. We can continue to fight it and really ameliorate kind of the impacts of oppression, but oppression will always exist in one form or another. And as long as oppression exists, I hope that my children know that their job is to fight it, regardless of who's on the receiving end of it, because they are privileged. They have education, they have the ability, they have a mother who has had these conversations with them. They've been immersed in these spaces. They understand in ways that I wish I understood when I was their age. With that privilege comes a responsibility, right? They have a responsibility to pay it forward, to do the work, whatever that looks like in their time and in their future. So I hope I'm planting those seeds. I hope that teachers find that in this book as well. I'm actually going to take a little bit of agency, if you don't mind. I'm going to read just the preface of the book. It was what I wrote to, the book was written for, the dedication page. And so we wrote for solidarity, because this book was written for solidarity, who stands as an unbreakable thread woven through the hearts of teachers, students, and community leaders, fortified by our ancestors. You are the soil that nourishes, the plants that feed us, the sunlit trees that stand tall. You are the steady hand that bridges divides, the voice whispering, we all rise together, and the echo declaring, in togetherness we heal. You inspire courage in adversity, embody resilience in every shared story, and nurture empathy where hope and knowledge grow. For the erased stories you elevate, the communities you unite around common causes, and the vision you sustain, a world where education is a bridge, balm, and beacon. May this book be a testament to your work and seed planted in the hands of those who carry it forward, rooted in the legacy of those who came before. May it invite readers to join the sacred act of uplifting every voice and building every bridge. That's this book. It's for solidarity. And it's solidarity among teachers, and it's solidarity with our students, and it's solidarity with students for each other. And it's everybody. It's your elementary students and your high school students and your teacher students. It's your college students. It's your math students. It's your science students. It's your English students. It's everybody. It's your white students and your Black students and your Palestinian students and your Latinx students. It's everybody. And if we don't rise in this moment, right? And this book was written before this time. We finished it during the campaign, but really, I feel like it's a futuristic moment, because this book meets this moment. And I always ask people, like, how are we going to meet this moment, right? What are we going to tell our kids? What are we going to tell our grandkids? Like, my grandfather told me how he fought. My grandfather told me those stories. He passed those on to me. I come from a lineage. My great grandmother, I have a picture of her on Instagram carrying a gun and fighting in the war. Right, that's my great grandmother. And for people who think that Palestinian or Arab women are weak, that we're male dominated, and that picture tells so many stories, right? I come from that lineage. I carry that in my heart. I carry that in my activism. I want my kids to look back and say, my sitto Sawsan, my grandmother Sawsan, this is what she did. This is how she contributed. This is how she rose to this moment and this occasion. I want them to find strength through me, whether I exist or not exist, through my stories, through the legacy that I'll leave behind for them. I want teachers to look back and say, this is how this book transformed this classroom and this moment, because we transform the world one person, one classroom, one school at a time. That's where transformation happens. It doesn't happen in Capitol Hill. It happens in our classrooms. We have the power to do that work. Every single one of us does. And even in the most antagonistic school districts where this work is hard, there's still room for you to elevate student stories and to give them the opportunity to become what oppressors of Frederick Douglass and others before him, but what they didn't give him is give them the tools to tell their own stories, to own their stories, to have the literacy, to be able to advocate and speak up for what they stand for, but most importantly, to love themselves at a time when the world around them is saying who you are isn't good enough and everything about you is wrong. We're going to create those spaces of love in our classrooms. And that's the work. That's the least we could do. And everybody can do that, right? Getting students, nobody's going to come back and say, we're going to censor your student's story. So why don't we give students the power of telling the stories and owning those stories and the tools to be able to do that in really impactful ways? We can all do the work if we want to. We just have to figure out how. And this book is the how.
And I appreciate you reading the preface. I'm so excited. I can't wait to get my copies. Coming to Zambia. Can't wait for it to come.
That's awesome.
In the next few weeks. But Sawsan, I want to finish this off with this question. And I ask everybody this question, and you've pretty much been answering it throughout. But I think to encapsulate this conversation, I'd love for you to just share how you continue to stay true to the teacher in you, even through this difficult time that we find ourselves in. How do you stay true to who you are?
I don't think it's a secret that the antagonism against Palestinian educators is more aggressive than ever. I don't think that it's a secret that antagonism towards people who are really pushing for real transformative equity and justice in classrooms is equally aggressive. And so I will just say the harder they push, the louder I'll speak. As long as I have the ability, the power, the privilege, the position to advocate for my students, I will continue to advocate for them and for what's right. Regardless, I would not be myself. I don't know how to operate in any other way. And I think that I really take the hearts of Ijeoma Olu. And if you haven't read her book, Be a Revolution, you absolutely should go out and get that book, because she talks about how all of this elevation of fear is doing exactly what it's supposed to be doing, because people are stepping back and they're just too afraid to say things and do things. And that's exactly what our oppressors want. And so the minute that we can kind of get over that initial fear, I have fear. I'm not fearless, obviously, and my family relies on my salary, so I need to work. The safety of my family is important to me too. Like, those things are all real, but the way I see it is, as long as I am giving into that, then the status quo is being preserved, and I cannot use my privilege to stay quiet when I am watching through a screen the children, the parents, the mothers, the amputations, the starvation, the babies in incubators, Hind Rajab, right? Ruh, these stories, these actual stories of people. I know that my children are my whole life, right? And these children are their parents' whole lives too. I can't watch and sit back while George Floyd, while all these different things are happening in our world, in our context, while we know that the suicide rate in Native American reservations starts at 5, and that the average lifespan is 40 years old on their own soil. We cannot stand by silently as these things continue to happen. I just can't. And so I will always stay true by using my power, my privilege, my voice, everything I know, every gift I've been given by God, by my ancestors, and through my education, to try as best as I can to dismantle and disrupt, regardless of what the cost of that is. I will not give in to that fear.
Yeah. And I thank you for being who you are. And I want to give you your flowers, because when we met at NCTE, you were just going through it just, emotionally, because there was just a lot going on. There was surveillance, and a lot of stuff we've been talking about was happening during NCTE. Going through that experience, and this was my first time going to the conference. I'd always wanted to go. I left that conference feeling like, why do we continue to go to spaces where our voices aren't welcomed and they're not respected. And it really got me thinking about the importance of creating our own spaces where we can have full ownership of our stories and our voice. And that's what ultimately gave me the motivation to say, hey, we need to start an Africanized conference. And I'm saying this publicly because that motivation came from what went on last November, and that carried through. So I say this to say, even as you're working through your pain to show up for those who can't show up for themselves, you're still inspiring people without even realizing it. And I want to thank you for doing that for me. I want to thank you for doing that for so many other people, so many other young people out there. And for those who have listened to this conversation and you're still scratching your head about what we just talked about, I want to say this, and I said this to you off camera, but I want to say this while the cameras are rolling. If you can understand Jim Crow and the mistreatment of Black people, if you can understand what happened to South Africans during apartheid, and still happening now, let's keep it real, it's still happening now. If you can understand what happened to indigenous people, and you can understand settler colonialism and how it's caused indigenous people to be displaced from their lands, from their reservations, fundamentally, you should be able to understand what's happening with regard to the Israeli occupation of Palestine. You don't have to understand everything, but as a human, fundamentally, you should understand that it's wrong. And that should be enough for us to go into action, not just as educators, but just as human beings. And I want to leave it at that. So I thank you for allowing us to have this conversation. And I want to end off by giving you an opportunity to share how people can connect with you on social media if they're not familiar with what your work is, even though they should be at this point. They should be, but some people just don't know who you really are.
Thank you, Kwame. I'm working on my website. We're revamping it. So my website is down at the moment, but I think I'm most active on Instagram. I was on Twitter, but the doxing on Twitter just got crazy. So I had to take out my Twitter, but I'm not as active on Blue Sky. LinkedIn, I guess professionally, Sawsan Jaber, but Instagram at SJ Educate is where I'm putting where I'm going to be next. And I have a couple of, not more than a couple, quite a few things lined up in the next few months. So I'll be in a lot of different places, and I hope to run into people who have listened to this conversation and continue the conversation, because no conversation is the whole conversation. It's just the beginning of a conversation, right? So
That's right.
I hope if anything happened here that it spiked your or piqued your curiosity to go and learn more. Pick up Ta-Nehisi Coates' book, pick up E.G. Omaulu's book, pick up Mornings in Jenin by Susan Abulhawa. There's so many great books out there. Angela Davis, From Ferguson to Palestine, A Struggle to Freedom, is another really great one that ties that.
Mark Lamont Hill.
Mark Lamont Hill. There's so many great books.
So many.
Noura Erakat is phenomenal, and she's a human rights Palestinian lawyer, and her social media page is always on fire too, so you could follow her and read her book. I forgot the title of her book, but just so many great resources. Go out there and get your own education. Don't rely on somebody else to feed you information, right? Rashid Al-Khalidi, 100 Years of War in Palestine, History of Palestine from a Palestinian Perspective, one that you'll never hear in an American setting or a public school or in any education. Go out there and nobody's saying read it and believe it, but go out there and get your own education, which is why I tell my students, here are all the perspectives. You decide what feels more true to your heart. I think once you've immersed yourself in different perspectives, the truth will emerge. You'll see it. It's really hard not to see it unless you don't want to see it. But go out there, get the books, pique your curiosity, and ask questions. Follow people on social media. There's so many great accounts that are really putting forth information to show the other perspective that we have continuously try to silence and erase in America. And there's a reason for that, right? Like I always go back to that South African proverb that when we talk about the lion and the hunter, you'll never hear the story of the lion. It's always the story of the hunter. And so let's just think about that and kind of end it with there. But go out there, get your information. SJ Educate on Instagram, Sawsan Jaber on LinkedIn, and then hopefully my website will be announced on either one of those soon enough.
Yes. And let's support our Palestinian journalists who are on the ground providing real information in real time, risking their livelihoods. Let's be honest.
Yep.
Let's support them, because what they're doing is providing us with an accurate account of what's going on. And you know what? The funding that you provide to them will help them continue to do this work that's benefiting so many people who are not where they are. So I want to make sure I voice that as well.
Definitely an intentional effort to kill our storytellers. And so by supporting them, that's a really important thing. But also do more than that. Once you know, and if you're listening to this conversation, talk to your elected officials, make the change. Like, this is a call to action. This is not just a knowing. It's not enough to know. I always tell my students, the question that I ask my kids is, now that you know, what are you going to do about what you know? Right? Like, it's not enough for us to sit in the knowing and not be able to do something with that knowledge. So, like, what are we doing with this knowledge? We have so much as American citizens. I think American citizens can have more of an impact on this issue particularly than any other group of people anywhere else in the world. And so we really need to actively use our voices and go out and buy this book, because we're in a pre-ordering phase, and the pre-ordering phase is so critical. So please go out, look it up, Pedagogies of Voice by Corwin. And if you use POV30 as a code, you get 30% off if you purchase your book. So go out and purchase your book. It's really, I believe, and it's not because I had anything to do with it, but I believe in my heart of hearts that this book is exactly what we need in this moment. And so I really hope that everybody reads it and takes something out of it to take back into your classroom, regardless of where your classroom is or what you teach or what level you teach. This book has some things in there for you. So please go out, purchase the book, read the book, use the book, and then tell us how awesome and how it transformed your practice. We'd love to hear about it.
You heard it here, people. So we're going to end it there. I thank everybody for coming on for another episode of Identity Talk for Educators Live. And as always, I wish you all good morning, good afternoon, good night, wherever you are in the world. We're going to do this again another time. Peace out, everybody.